So the United States has set out to reinsert itself in Asia actively in two areas. These territorial disputes with the Chinese have been trying to downplay with all kinds of bilateral agreements with their neighbors, and trade. So in 2010, Hillary Clinton went to the ASEAN summit. We now attend ASEAN meetings all the time. And she declared that the disputes in the South China Sea, which are territorial and basically involve the presence of oil and gas in large quantities, that those disputes should be settled immediately in a multilateral context in which the US should be present. As I say, up until now, we hadn't been going to those meetings, and China had been quietly signing bilateral agreements. The Chinese did not take well to this, especially when in that speech Hillary Clinton referred to the South China Sea as the West Philippine Sea. That was not lost on Beijing. And you probably have seen in the press that island disputes in that whole region have been festering now in recent months and even the last 2 years. You can see on this map that red line is the Chinese claim. Yeah. Now, theoretically, the maritime claims are based on the law of the Sea Convention, 200 nautical miles from your coast. The Chinese are forwarding a claim based on 2,000 years of history, saying that historically this is the Chinese zone of influence. Now, Vietnam is doing something similar. The next line in, the blue one, is the Vietnamese claim, based on Vietnamese holdings in the 17th century. So this is a spaghetti. I mean, and further north, the Japanese and the Chinese have claims that the South Koreans are also involved. Taiwan is involved. It's very unlikely that this is going to be solved anytime soon. And in the meantime, tensions are rising. ASEAN, this organization of Southeast Asian states, had its 45th summit 2 months ago, and for the first time in their history, they couldn't agree on a final communique. They're being dragged apart here by China and the US, with Cambodia closer to China. Vietnam today would like us to make them a full-fledged ally. They would like us to reopen our naval base at Cam Ranh Bay. They want us to base our aircraft carriers there. We've signed a nuclear agreement with Vietnam. So this is building up now around the periphery of China. And the Chinese are starting to get concerned. The Japanese Defense Ministry issued a white paper last month of increased influence, and that the consequences of this are difficult to foresee. We have 60 civilian bilateral commissions with the Chinese, all kinds of interaction. It's a very grounded relationship. We have almost no contact with their military. And the problem is that with their leadership transition now, the new generation coming in of Xi Jinping will be the first one that will not have been handpicked by Deng Xiaoping before he died. He sort of looked ahead about two cycles of leaders and pretty much singled out who they should be. This group doesn't have that imprimatur, whereas a lot of his people are in the high ranks of the military. So there's concern that we may have pushed a little hard, that this leadership transition may get out of balance. The Bo Xilai affair has many deep layers to it, involving the poisoning of the British businessman. Many people in Washington believe that Bo Xilai was in close contact with nationalist elements of the military who were supporting his rise. So anyway, there are rumblings in China right now, and we are extending our hand now for the first time to the Chinese military, inviting them to join our naval exercises as a result of these new tensions. On the trade side, it's also pretty interesting. As I mentioned, the Japanese were favoring this East Asia trade zone. The Japanese government changed about a year later, and the new government is more on our wavelength. And so we have proposed a counter idea, a counter initiative on trade. It's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And rather than being an Asian zone, it'll be a Pacific zone. In other words, no lines drawn across the Pacific. We fully included, along with Canada, Mexico, Chile. Anybody who's a rim nation of the Pacific can join. There's only one proviso. You have to qualify. You have to have a basically free market economy and protect intellectual property. Guess who doesn't qualify? The Chinese. So their proposal excludes us, our proposal excludes them. We want to have this thing signed by the end of next year if possible. It's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Mitt Romney has said he will embrace this policy. He agrees with this trade zone idea. One thing though, he proposes to change the name of the Trans-Pacific Partnership to the Reagan Economic Zone. That is officially going to be the new title of this initiative if the Republicans come in, but it will go forward. So there are tensions brewing, and I guess what we're doing is hedging against China's rise. And the question some people pose in Washington is whether hedging this way might create what we're worried about. And of course, their opinions differ as to what the proper approach should be. Now, going briefly to the Middle East, it's always difficult to be brief about the Middle East, but as we all know, the region is being roiled. Even as we leave Iraq and as we're getting out of Afghanistan, I have a lot to say about Afghanistan if anyone has a question about that. The Arab Spring is, as I said, morphing into phase 2. In the first phase, with the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi, a well-educated young man in Tunisia who couldn't find a job at the level of his skills and education, I have many students at the U today in exactly that same situation. This is a very well-traveled, well-educated generation, and there are not enough good jobs out there for them. And when Mohamed Bouazizi couldn't even sell fruit in the market, he burned himself alive. And it went viral on the all the new media. This was really a social justice issue. The youth bulge in the Middle East, the lack of jobs, all these things figured in. And we've had all these political changes since. Many Muslim-based parties are being elected in places like Tunisia and Egypt. The Muslim parties tend to be providing welfare to the local population in many of these countries, and as a result, they're popular. Many of these parties coming in are moderate, but through the region there is a trend among the Salafist groups. Salaf means ancestor in Arabic, and these are kind of more fundamental groups in the Muslim world. So the tensions are in each country between these two groups. But it's taken a new step. Early this year, the Turkish foreign minister visited Iran and made a major speech in which he warned against a Sunni-Shia regional war that was emerging in the region and which was being actively fomented by outside powers. Now, what did he mean by this? This is not just a question, the Turks feel, of Iraq or Syria or Bahrain individually. It's moving toward a regional war. That is the Sunni crescent through the Middle East. And in many countries, whether it's Bahrain or Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, you have large Shia populations which all through history, at least modern history, under the Ottoman Empire, 500 years, were out of power. The Ottoman Turks always ruled through the Sunnis, wherever, whether they're minority or majority. And our invasion of Iraq empowered the Sunnis, the Shia rather, in the region for the first time. And a lot of this is following from that basic shift. Now, in Syria, you have along the coast there the Alawites, who are Shiite, and the family of Assad. Up in the north, you have the Kurds, just like in Iraq, and then down in the south and over toward Iraq, a Sunni mass. 60 to 65% of the population. They're the ones who are revolting. And right next door in Iraq, you have just the obverse. You have the white is a large Sunni mass, which is contiguous with the Sunni group in Syria. It's one Sunni group in the middle And then you've got the, in green you have the Shiites down in the coast, and up in the north, the Kurds. Al-Qaeda in Iraq has declared recently that its goal is a unified Iraqi-Syrian state under a religious government. And let me give you an example of how these issues are exploding right now. The day, and I mean the day rather than night, that we left Iraq at the end of last year, December 31st, 2011, as our last troops left, the Shiite Prime Minister of Iraq, Mr. al-Maliki, issued an arrest warrant for his vice president, Mr. al-Hashimi, who was a Sunni, the leading Sunni in Iraq, accusing him of terrorism and of having tried to assassinate him. Well, in the dead of night, this Sunni vice president escaped, and he fled north into Kurdistan, up on the right there. Now, this tells you a lot about contemporary Iraq. The government in Baghdad has no suzerainty in Kurdistan. They cannot come in and arrest the Sunni vice president. They do not have the power to do that. Now, the tensions have increased since then. A lot of the Sunnis pulled out of the parliament. And so these tensions are emerging just as the war is underway in Syria. And there are increasing signs that the Sunnis are joining up on both sides. And the two outside powers that the Turks warned against are the Saudis, who are putting in big money, trying to favor the Sunnis throughout the region, and Iran coming in on the other side. There's a writer who was really prescient about this several years ago, a fellow named Vali Nasser, N-A-S-R. He's just become the dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington. He wrote a book called The Shia Revival in 2006, in which he said the new Middle East that is emerging will not be defined by an Arab identity or by any particular form of government, whether democratic or other. Ultimately, the character of the region will be decided in the crucible of the Shia revival and the Sunni response to it. And he wrote further, he drew a parallel between this situation and the situation in Europe after Luther nailed the theses to the door in Wittenberg. The religious wars in Europe make anything out here look like child's play in comparison. They raged for 150 years until 1648. Over a third of Germany's population died in the process. And so Vali Nasser writes that just as the settlement of religious conflicts marked Europe's passage to modernity, so the Middle East will have to achieve sectarian peace before it can begin to live up to its potential. So as we try to pivot from this region, not even to mention Iran and Israel, which is a whole other story here. These regional tensions are rising fast. There's no one more worried about this than the Turks, because for Turkey, if you look at it from their point of view, let me see, there's a slide that kind of shows this. Okay, here are these Alawite Shiites here along this side. They and a group called the Alevis make up 20% of Turkey's population across the border. There are 20% of Turkey's population are Shiites related to the Assad group. And as these refugees come in, things are kind of getting more unstable in Turkey. In addition, the Kurdish population of Syria is starting to team up with the Kurdish population of Iraq. The Kurds are an ancient people. They're probably the ancient Medes of the Bible. They've lived on that territory since time immemorial. After World War I, President Wilson at the Versailles Conference came out in favor of a Kurdish state. And it's long been US policy that there should eventually be a Kurdish state. So Turkey now is apoplectic about what's going on. The Kurdish terrorists are stepping up their attacks, and the Turks are convinced that the Iranians are aiding the Kurds right now in this, trying to destabilize Turkey. So, which of course is a major NATO ally. So Washington is extremely concerned, I mean almost day by day. And how do we go in? How do we intervene in a situation like this?